Chapter 16 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 16. Logic. It would be difficult for me to describe what a strange effect all this had on Robert Parks. Directly Dr. Everett had left the room, he sat erect and looked about him like one dazed. He insult a friend of Dr. Everett! If there was one person on the earth to whom this lofty young man felt grateful, it was the doctor. What would he not have borne rather than have said a word to hurt his feelings? Were they hurt? What a strange idea! Did people really feel that way about the Lord? Wait, what was it that Dr. Everett said? Had he actually insulted the Lord? His cheek paled at the thought. He had not meant that. He had always prided himself on the respect which he felt for religion. He really did not know what he had meant by his tirade, save that he was angry with Mr. Cady, and wanted to express his feelings in some severe way. He had fallen into the habit, common to many young men, of speaking about God in a free and careless manner, as though he were but another human being. His mother would have been shocked by this habit, as she would by many another. Robert, in thinking the matter over, was rather ashamed of himself, but the thought that lingered was this strange one, of having offended Dr. Everett by insulting his friend. The doctor had said that this friend was dearer to him than his mother, and what would not Robert Parks have endured rather than be guilty of speaking a disrespectful word of Dr. Everett's mother? Another thought clung, that word which he at first had not noticed, as many as I love. He felt sick and sad and desolate. Just at that moment, a reaction having taken place in his feelings, he felt very worthless. It seemed marvelously improbable that the Lord loved him. Yet his long years of early training by a Christian mother had taught him intellectually that such was the case. Really, when he came to think of it, the fact that one so neglected and insulted should continue to love him was enough to fill his heart with amazement. Another thing, they believed, these Christians, that God looked down on all the minute affairs of men, and so directed and guided matters that in the end the right thing was worked out. He had laughed at this belief during these later years, but he had not quite sneered at it, because he knew that his mother leaned on it for support in all her trials, and he had to admit to himself that somehow she was wonderfully supported in heavy trials. Yet, what an absurd belief! Suppose, for instance, that God knew all about what had transpired at the store that day, interested himself in it. Would he, if the trial had come to one of his servants, arrange so that it should eventually be an aid to him? Preposterous! Yet, now that he was calmer, and was ashamed of his former passion, he forced himself to look the matter steadily in the face and ask, why? Was it because God was not capable of attending to the multitudinous affairs of all created beings? But what sort of a God would that be to create worlds which he was powerless to manage? And after all, somebody certainly managed greater issues than these. Robert's hoped-for college course had been a false hope, yet he was sufficiently educated to be aware of the fact that there went on every day all about him in earth and air and sea and sky wonders and mysteries that called for infinitely greater wisdom than it would take to manage the details of any man's business, however complicated those details might be. It was folly to say that God was not equal to the exercise of a very minute providence, if he chose. Then did the difficulty lie in the fact that these matters were of such small consequence as to be beneath him? But it was one evidence of a great mind to be able to stoop from great and important matters, and interest itself in trivialities. Had he not once seen President Lincoln stop in his walk along the street, and help to hunt for a penny that had rolled away from a little girl? Had he not heard the Secretary of the Treasury say to the Secretary of War, that there shone out the great mind, which could not only grapple with and conquer grave state problems, but in the very act of discussing these problems could stop and find a penny for a crying child? Robert Parks remembered just how much he had admired the act. Was his brain really so obtuse that he could not see in it an illustration of what God's providential care of the world might be? Was it common sense to speak of this little act as a mark of Mr. Lincoln's superior mind, and then when the act was multiplied by millions and repeated each moment of time, sneer at it as a thing belittling to one's idea of God? Robert's lip curled a little over the remembrance that he had himself presented this illogical argument at one time, in debating the question with what he now called a wooden-headed young man, who could not see the folly of it. But directly his face darkened in a frown. There was one of the verses learned in his boyhood which he did not like. "All things work together for good to them that love God." If I were God, and he said the words almost angrily, I wouldn't be vindictive toward those who didn't love me. I would use my infinite power to make things work for their good also. He was somewhat shocked at himself for this mental outburst, and, besides, recognized almost immediately the folly of it. How could the commander of an army so manage matters that a soldier in rebellion would believe that his highest good was being sought? Only then did there dawn on Robert Parks's mind a suggestion that possibly God was at this moment at work for the highest good of all his subjects, and it was only because those in rebellion thwarted his will that they did not reap the benefit of the promise. There seemed just then to rush over this poor Satan-tempted young man such a sense of the rest that there might be in just lying passive in the heart of an infinitely wise friend, letting him plan the way, and point it out, step by step, thus forever removing one from the labyrinths of doubt and nerve-trying decisions, that the thought almost brought the tears. It cannot be true. He did not realize that he had spoken the words aloud until they were answered. I dare say it is, though. Ever so many things are true which seem as though they could not be. It was Joy Saunders, another friend of this one of whom Dr. Everett always spoke as though he were a man living just within hearing all the time. Would she have felt personally hurt had she heard the words he spoke but a little while ago? Robert Parks was very fond of talking with Joy. He was in the habit of seizing every opportunity, though, to be sure, there were few. Mrs. Saunders had relaxed none of her vigilance since he became a member of the family, and while the touch of Joy's fingers was felt all about the house, glimpses of her were rare. Suppose he should speak aloud again and hear her view of what was passing in his mind? She had a way of talking about unreal things as though she saw with keener eyes than others. I'm moralizing, he said, trying to speak lightly. Studying up an abstruse religious point. You never gave me credit for being so worthily employed, did you? Miss Joy, are you one of those who think that the Lord keeps guard over people, looks after their affairs, you know, small as well as great, plans for them and brings them out all right? I don't believe it. Don't you? Said Joy quietly. She had an advantage over this young man in that he couldn't shock her. Robert rather liked to shock people occasionally, but Joy seemed quietly indifferent to his views. Possibly he only does it for some people, she said. There was once a man in trouble who had brought the trouble on himself by living a very foolish life, but the Lord looked after him and brought him safely through and gave him prosperity. That is certainly true, and of course, what he has done he may choose to do again. In fact, he has promised, you know, only there are conditions. The man of whom I spoke met the conditions. Some people will not. What are the conditions? They are hard, harder than anything else he has given people to do. I mean they are hard for some persons, for you, Mr. Parks. So hard that I am often afraid you will keep on refusing them until you have lost all your opportunities. But the returns are very sure. History says that this man humbled himself greatly and besought the Lord. I don't think any other way than that has ever been found. And then Joy, having delivered her message, slipped quietly away, leaving the haughty spirit to fight out his battle, alone if he would, with an infinite helper, if he would meet the conditions. End of chapter 16. Recording by Trisha G.